I always thought the Downing Street party scandals, okay, were a bit contrived. Okay, now my wife completely disagrees with me on this, but I just go, you've got. I mean, if Downing Street, just people, it isn't a house; it's a bloody great office. There are about 250, 300 people working there. Okay, bigger than that. Most of the time, they met in the garden. If I had had to go into work every day during COVID in an office of 300 people, would I on Friday evenings have said, we'll go out on the roof terrace or the garden and we'll just, at a reasonable distance, have a bit of wine? And on someone's birthday, if you've been working your balls off, would someone produce a bottle of wine and a cake? Well, they were working together anyway. It wasn't actually materially affecting the transmission of the disease. I thought that was a bit of a load of contrived bollocks, to be honest. Now, my wife completely disagrees with me. She thinks it's an absolutely shocking scandal. But my point is that you can choose to make that a page 7 story or a page 1 story that runs for 5 days.
And that'll dictate the reaction of the public as well, because they understand the importance between what page it's on.
They totally, I mean, you might argue online there isn't quite the same potency that there used to be with a front page story because the internet doesn't have a front page, which might lead to everybody thinking everything that they worry about is really important because there's no page 27. I'd also make the point about the post office accounting scandal that, without the slightest bit of criticism of the brilliant journalism that actually uncovered the story and stuck with it, they did make a fatal mistake, which is they called it an accounting scandal. Now, it wasn't an accounting scandal. The scandal was people were prosecuted when most people suspected they were innocent, and that the organisation was so paranoid about its reputation that it was more willing to send completely innocent people to jail blamelessly than it was to actually acknowledge that it might have made a mistake. But if you add the word accounting to anything, you rob it of its interest. Okay, it's like a complete interest vampire. It's the opposite of something sexual. Right?
A percentage of us switch off immediately because it's not as excitatory as
it's just accounting. I'm not going to read about. I mean, if I were at work, right, and someone said the people from accounts are having a finance orgy on, in the garden, I probably wouldn't bother looking out of the window because the word orgy is cancelled out in its interest by the word accounting. And so by describing it as an accounting scandal, that was an absolutely fatal mistake, I think, because that's of massive interest to kind of people who work for Price Waterhouse, I guess. But for the wider public, it's just not going to get any traction because it's technical. Who wants to read about accounting errors, okay, compared to something a bit more salacious? So that word accounting, financial, words like fiduciary can be brilliantly used in a way to bury a story, because what you do is you rob it of its interest for anybody except a tiny number of people. And then you get the LA Times effect where editors just go, look, our readers aren't interested in this stuff.
Whereas in contrast, when you put top judge, the seniority makes it attractive and interesting, because if it was somebody junior, a minor local magistrate, it's not got the same executive powers like high court judges involved in sex scandals.
You can't say we're giving this story an immense amount of prominence because we know our readers are a load of prurient, voyeuristic perverts. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to come up with some public interest argument that effectively defends the amount of attention you're giving to the story, despite the fact that the principal interest in the story is really prurient.
Yeah.
That happens now, by the way. Local papers, there are small local papers. If someone has sex with a goat, okay, there are small local papers which get more online readers in a week than they've had in the previous 30 years, simply because the story goes viral in a way that most local stories don't.
Yeah, I interviewed a behavioral psychologist a couple of years ago called Daniel Crosby, and he spoke about the excitatory power of money. But when you mention accounting, that excitatory power is cancelled out, which is fascinating. Absolutely. It's all about how you present it.
I think looking back, I don't think it was intentional. Had it been intentional by an evil person working in the post office's PR department to endlessly refer to it as an accounting scandal, and that's not the scandal. The scandal has nothing to do with the accounting. The scandal, it's not. It's a problem if you have a completely faulty accounting system. That's a problem. It's not a scandal. What's a scandal? And by the way, okay, this shows one of the interesting facets to me of the accounting scandal was what someone should have done. And in fairness, the two guys who are from the forensic accounting investigative team kind of got close to this. Okay. If there are a load of people nicking from the post office. Now, just to be clear, and this is the only item in the post office's defence, all right? When you introduce new software, new systems, or new procedures, it's not that uncommon for that to actually reveal pre-existing fraud. Because the hacks that people have discovered to get around the system and nick money suddenly don't work anymore because you've changed the system.
The loopholes have been closed.
The loopholes have been closed, or they aren't quick enough to adapt. The classic example of this is when they first introduced mobile phone parking apps in various parts of the UK. The reason those mobile phone apps rolled out so fast is that they did a trial in sort of 10 streets, and they suddenly realized that actually about a third of the money, that the coins that got put into meters, were never reaching the council. People had worked out ways, whether it was meter collectors or other people who could just break into meters. I'm not sure what it was, but people had basically worked out ways to nick lots of the money, and were probably clever enough not to nick all the money, after all, so that it wouldn't arouse suspicion. And so you introduce mobile phone parking apps, and suddenly there's this huge volume of fraud that becomes apparent that was never visible before. So the post office shouldn't have been surprised, in a sense, that a certain number of people were, at fault or guilty of false accounting or something. Maybe that wasn't happening, but it shouldn't have surprised them, even if it wasn't, by the way, true. But where it was undoubtedly failed, okay, is if you had a few hundred people who are basically stealing from the post office, you would expect some sort of statistical pattern, some sort of unevenness. I don't know, it could be men more often than women, urban more often than rural, new hires more often than long-standing post office employees. All right. It could be, people who are, the kind of thing. If you've got a sub postmaster who's kind of running, 2 American muscle cars and has a hot tub, you might go,
he arouses probably, some suspicion.
There's a little bit, but the fact that there were as far as I see, there were absolutely no patterns in the people they prosecuted. There was no kind of, in other words, it looked like a random cross section of the sub postmaster population. And when that's the case, I agree it's a dog that doesn't bark in the night. In other words, it's the absence of data rather than the presence of data. But the sheer absence of any kind of statistical data that suggested it's these kind of people who are doing it. The fact that there was no pattern to it at all, in a sense there you have a case where the pattern is no pattern. The data is no data. And nobody, as far as I'm concerned, once you had a few hundred people who are being prosecuted, it's quite easy to tell whether it's a technical glitch, which would affect people randomly, or actual intentional crime, because the first one won't show a pattern, and any kind of demographic pattern, and the second one almost certainly will.
I hope you enjoyed that clip. For more on my channel, hit the link just here, subscribe, and you can enjoy the full episode.